Why don't you sit here and then I'll call you up? Yes, down, down. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Here on, I think it's day 6 at day 7 of COP here at the Ocean Pavilion. Those who are joining virtually, it's good to see you. My name is Mark Shimamoto, Vice President for Global Outreach and Partnerships for AGU, which is a geoscience association that supports about 500,000 Earth and space scientists in 148 countries in nearly every part of the world. This year in particular, AGU is celebrating a movement that really speaks to one of our central goals, which is to drive discovery and solutions to scientific and societal challenge. And this movement in particular is called open science. From observing the life cycle of plankton smaller than the grain of sand, to calculating Greenland ice sheet loss, to science just the science around those areas allows us to understand our world and how it's changing and what we can do to create a better future, which is more crucial and critical than ever before as our climate crisis deepens. But one thing we've learned, especially here this week, is science doesn't live in a vacuum. In fact, quite the opposite is true. At its best, science is transparent, it's accessible, it's reproducible. It builds on what came before, breaks new ground, and asks new questions. And open science is really all of that and so much more. In 2021, 193 countries adopted UNESCO's definition of open science, which advocates for increasing scientific collaboration and sharing information for the benefit of science and society, making scientific knowledge openly available, accessible, and reusable for everyone. An opening of scientific knowledge creates the opportunity for evaluation and communication to others, especially marginalized communities. A cornerstone of open science is open access, which means that scholarly journal articles and other published scientific materials are distributed online and completely free to be accessed by any reader. There are no hoops to jump through. All anyone in the world needs is a computer and hopefully an internet connection. And AGU is actively advancing the open science dialogue by transitioning many of our journals to open access over the past decade, with many more journals set to transition in the years to come. One of AGU's journals, Water Resources Research, which publishes original scholarship on the movement and management of Earth's water, is transitioning to fully open access at the start of the new year, and we are very excited to see that transition. As climate change wreaks havoc on societies and ecosystems across the world, from floods, droughts, degraded air quality caused by wildfires and anthropogenic pollution, and the need for transparent, accessible research about the planet's water has perhaps been never greater. But open access doesn't just mean that paywalls are gone. It means that articles are published under Creative Commons licenses, allowing other permissions to share, adapt, and build off the research while still giving the original author credit. Yet a scientific study is nothing without the data that underpins the results. And at AGU, we believe that Earth and space science data are a world heritage and a critical part of the science ecosystem. That's where FAIR principles come in. FAIR, hopefully you may know, means data that is findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. FAIR means exactly what it stands for. It's about making sure that communities have access to the data and the software they need to both validate the science and solve new problems, to take that research one step further, or maybe in another altogether surprising direction. At the same time, AGU ascribes to the as open as possible, as closed as necessary approach. Some data should be cared for ethically and responsibly, including personal and health data protections as an example. In addition, Indigenous knowledge holders who have historically been excluded or taken advantage of in the name of science should instead be equal partners and beneficiaries of science. that really hits home on the people approach to open science, both inside and outside the scientific community. Within the sciences, there's still a large gap in opportunity and invisibility for underrepresented and marginalized communities. Actions to increase diversity, equity, inclusion are central to opening science and correcting historical injustices. Science institutions should apply these inclusive practices, including direct support for recruiting, admitting, and retaining students from historically marginalized backgrounds, and journal publishers should provide funding support for publishing fees for those who need additional ways to benefit from the publishing process, and of course, diversify editorial boards. Removing disparities in the geosciences is not only good for the underrepresented scientists, it's also good for science. Diversity broadens perspectives on research, questions, and simply produces better results. Up to this point, we've kind of talked about open access, lowering paywalls to science papers, and fair data principles, removing barriers to data, and DEI practices to welcome people from underrepresented backgrounds in the field of valued contributors. The question then is, what does open science lead us up to? And I really think the answer lies in the hands of those who, through open science, now have access to knowledge and data they might not have been able to access otherwise. It's the scientists at an institution without the resources to pay for journal subscriptions, but through open access and fair principles, they are now able to utilize groundwater data to help her or their community manage water resources or heat maps to identify neighbors most vulnerable to heat stress. It's about community science, a collaborative, mutually beneficial partnership where community scientists work together to advance the local priorities. And since 2013, AGU's Thriving Earth Exchange has launched nearly 300 community science projects around the world to do exactly that and build healthy, resilient, and just futures. Open science is also about the countries having the needed resources to understand how their environment, economy, their public health are changing in response to a changing climate, and how they might set policies and invest resources to adapt, mitigate, and reduce those vulnerabilities. And ultimately, open science is about whether negotiations happening right now, just a few buildings away here at COP28, is driven by science that speaks to the priorities and the needs of the poor as much as it does the wealthy, the rural, and the urban, and the global south as much as the global north. That is open science at its full potential, but we will still have a long way to go. So I've given a little bit of a broad overview of how AGU sees and is engaging in the open science dialogue, as well as looking a little bit to the future of what its implications and possibilities could behold. So I'm thrilled to now kind of turn to a panel of esteemed scientists and innovators who are here today to deepen the conversation with their insights in some of the challenges, debates, and opportunities in this space. So first, joining us virtually is Dr. Irena, who is the Vice Principal of Research and Innovation at the University of Toronto. Hi, Irena. How are you? It's good to see you. And next, if you would like to join me in this seat, is Stephen Hammer, day 6 CEO of the New York Climate Exchange. Thank you for being here, Stephen. And next is Soudeh Kamali, a postdoctoral fellow in the Advanced Study Program of the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, Colorado, USA. Soudeh, it's a pleasure to have you. It's good to see you. And then last, we're hoping we will have an additional panelist who may be joining us a bit late, Nana Klutse, who is a professor of climatology at the University of Ghana and also serves as the vice chair of IPCC's Working Group 2 for AR7 cycle. And hopefully she will be joining midway through the panel. So I am going to sit down with our panelists, both here in the room and in person, and kick us off with a few questions. And then we will eventually move to the audience. So if you have any questions, start thinking about them now, and we will have a great opportunity to further the discussion with you all here today. All right, I've adjusted to the panel side. It's good to see you. I'm gonna kind of open it up with a question to everyone. to think about, from your own distinct roles, the actions that you're doing or engaging with in the scientific enterprise, the broader societal enterprise, and your views on kind of the open science arena and movement overall. I'll start with you today. If you can kind of provide your assessment kind of the state of the science of open science, and where do you think we as a community, not just the scientific community, is succeeding, as well as perhaps where there is room for improvement?
Is that working? Yes. Thanks for having me here, Mark. So if we think about the climate and we see that it's a complex problem that we're facing with multiple disciplines involved, and the state of open science is very different at each one of those disciplines, and majority of the times when we're looking for those innovative solutions to our problems, they lie at the intersection of those disciplines. So if we don't have the same state for open science and we don't have standardization across that, that's going to slow down the progress. And I'll give you an example. A majority of my research had been in the aerospace sector. I have a mechanical engineering degree, but in the past 2 years, I've been working in earth system sciences in the atmospheric science world. And just transitioning from those two fields in the atmospheric science, there's just so much data available in comparison. There's a lot of code available. There's tutorials teaching you how to use that code, how to interpret the data, which is very different to the aerospace sector. And if you think of aviation as one of our major problems, so the solution to that aviation problem probably lies at the intersection of aerospace and atmospheric science. And if we don't have that standardization, that's going to slow us down. And the second point that I wanted to make is that the climate problem is a global problem. And again, the state of open science is not the same across the world. It's very different. And even if we have access to the science, when it comes to access to the solutions and technologies that come from that science, that's where the major problem is. So another personal example is I was at a workshop last year, and I was teaching about an open source code that I work with. And there was a gentleman from a developing world, and he was telling me, well, I have that code too. I have access to it. I just don't have the supercomputer, the computing power to run it. So taking that in mind, and the third point, and I won't go into details of it, we need to change our perspective to learn to look for solutions in all communities and all parts of the world. Sometimes with open science, it seems that it's a one-way direction where we think only a particular community or part of the world has that solution, and that's going to hinder us and slow us down. And I want to end in a positive note saying that it is exciting that we are moving this way. And there's going to be a lot of progress made, but we do have to bear in mind that there are challenges that with equity that we need to take care of.
Wonderful. And I'm going to pivot. Thank you for that feedback. And I think it's especially important, that communication piece and translation piece, not within science, but across science, and then also that inclusive power. So thank you for those comments. I wanted to go virtually to Irena, if you wanted to provide your thoughts kind of on both the opportunities and challenges in this kind of movement space and how we've progressed.
Well, thank you so much, and greetings, everybody. First of all, Mark, after your opening comments, it's hard not to be really excited about the concept of open science. But what I want to do is take maybe a bit of a more cautionary approach and talk about what is the goal of open science. And when we look at the 2021 UNESCO recommendation on open science, it actually states that open science aims to make scientific research available to the benefit of everyone. But what do we mean by scientific research? Does it mean full access to the raw data collected in a research project? Does it mean access to the experimental design, the protocols and methods? Does it mean access to the details of interpretation and analysis? Or does it just mean free access to peer-reviewed publications at the end of a scientific process? In the view of UNESCO, all information generated in the processes of scientific knowledge creation, evaluation, and communication must be available to societal actors. And by this, we mean like the non-scientists. And from a Canadian government perspective, we use a similar statement. Open science includes scientific inputs, scientific outputs, and all processes associated with research. This broad definition actually emphasizes that data collected as part of a scientific study should be open and freely available to non-scientists. And so here's the cautionary note. I think that there may be risks. Open science may mean that data collected by a scientist for one purpose, i.e., you have a hypothesis and you want to test it, can be lifted and used by untrained researchers. And these individuals can then adjust, select, or modify the data until the data meets their hypothesis and the quality of truth leads to contradictions and potentially a transfer of misknowledge. So open science can actually, if not used and not have proper safeguards, destroy the integrity of science. And any evidence-based decision-making can become misleading and possibly dangerous. So this is a heavy note, but I really want to kind of emphasize the point that we need to understand what the goal is of open science and what we mean by it. There's one thing also to transfer knowledge, and yet there is another to translate this knowledge into policies and practices that can be useful to non-scientists. And so I think that open science should not only just focus on the science itself, but on the translation of this knowledge. Finally, I would like to say that, you mentioned about indigenous knowledge systems, and we have to also respect the rights of indigenous knowledge holders, whether they want to become part of open science or not. And if they do not want to be part of open science, I'd be cautionary about what that might mean of us unintentionally creating further biases in our knowledge systems, being mostly Western influenced and ignoring some of the very important indigenous knowledge systems. And so I think we need to think very carefully about what we mean and define as open science. We need to think realistically, respectfully, and practically in how we implement it. So to answer your first question, I would say we are succeeding in society's recognition of the importance of open science. Where we can improve is I think we need to really think deeply about the definition of open science. How it's used by UNESCO and nation states is a much more inclusive way than the way that you described in your opening comments, Mark. I think that if it is truly going to be as open as the UNESCO recommendation to open science is, we may need to establish some safeguards to ensure that the open science is not vulnerable to misuse or abuse. And we also need to continue to remove barriers to ensure equitable access to open science. But I also think that we need to continue to elevate the importance of translating the science for different audiences and building greater bridges to the science and policy practice interface. Thank you, Mark.
Wonderful points and really critical questions, right? It is an evolution, and there are definitely things that we need to ask ourselves as a scientific community, from society. What does it mean? And I think it's going to become more and more critical for those boundary spanners to translate that information, and still uphold the strong scientific processes, so people have trust in the information they're being supplied. I may have a follow-up question a little later to think about some of those best practices to start exploring. But for now, I will turn to Steve. Steve Hammer, do you want to share your perspective on kind of the approach of where you view the expanse of opportunities as well as challenges in open science from both maybe your past and your new current exciting role at the New York Climate Exchange?
Well, thanks very much, and I appreciate the way you introduced the panel. You said there were esteemed scientists, so that's the people I'm sharing the stage with, and then there's the others. So I'm the consumer, and I'm hopefully the innovator, because I'm 6 days into a new job, a new think tank that is hopefully going to really employ community science, open science, to expand opportunities for communities in New York City in particular, but also in other urban areas, other parts of the world. We're a think tank that is going to be based in New York City, and we will think hard about how climate will impact New York City, what the opportunities are. But we'll take some of that knowledge and we'll help try and scale it and translate it elsewhere. we're also going to focus on parallel issues that we could learn from. And so this notion of what are the models, how are they relevant to us, or indeed, are they structured in a way, or the questions posed in a way that it biases it towards a particular economic strata, a particular an assumption about the availability of access to information, the availability of access to finance, the availability of access to technology. Those are the questions that are going to be really important to us. I can imagine a situation, well, first off, let me just go back to the point you asked about how I used this in the past. So I came from the World Bank. I was at the World Bank for a decade, where you see massive information asymmetries between the global north and the global south. And part of the challenge that existed for many of the projects that I worked on, as well as my colleagues, was how we can expand the information that would help inform the work that we were trying to undertake in collaboration with our partner governments. Because I came from the part of the World Bank that primarily worked with governments, not the private sector. That was a different team. One of the things we often found was the fundamentals that we would just completely take for granted in the North simply didn't exist. A land use cadastre, which told you what buildings, who owns land, that has a very fundamental impact on policies that are made, because you can begin to find out who wins and loses. That affects transfer of land rights. That affects the accumulation of wealth of individuals or of communities. Having some of that basic information is fundamental to some of the policy prescriptions that might typically be recommended to a government. And one of the strategies that colleagues have done is to deploy platforms like OpenStreetMap, where they would go out and a kid with a phone, a smartphone, could begin to drop pins where there were particular types of land uses. And all of a sudden you began to quickly accumulate information, and now you can have a much more informed conversation about what is going on, what the implications are. And so particularly in the area that I'm most familiar with is in the disaster response world, where you could do disaster assessments post-hurricane, post-earthquake, what have you, by quickly having people identify the structures that were most at risk or the structures that have been deployed, because all of a sudden that quickly could inform the type of response that's needed, the type of financing or funding levels that are needed, and you are actively engaging the community to feed this information in, and then they would more rapidly benefit from the response measures. So, that's a very applied use of this information, and critical for lives, critical for livelihoods going forward. So sometimes this is put out there in the sake of advancing scientific, more pure science, more theoretical questions, but in some cases there are very immediate applications that can make a difference, again, in terms of lives and livelihoods. So as I now translate kind of what I learned from that context and hearing about what colleagues here have mentioned, as we think about how to engage different communities around New York City and other urban areas and other parts of the world, this is how you can, begin to train the next generation of scientists, involving them in the data collection process, involving them in the data analysis process. One of the things that Mark and I have had another conversation on a few days ago was how organizations like AGU can help mentor communities. And so trying to bring these pieces together, that's something that we're hoping to be able to capitalize on, be able to innovate in, to really ensure that communities who have felt like ignored by the policy process, ignored by where finance has flowed, that we can help them put the information together. That information turns into political power. That political power turns into finance power, and hopefully we can begin to move them so that they can benefit from some of the technology advances, some of the efforts to enhance resilience in communities that they would really badly need going forward.
I think that's a great commentary, both on the kind of divide of knowledge, the access of knowledge, the way knowledge is collected. That could be biased in its own right, but also the accessibility of using that and having the right, appropriate people, whether they're scientists or non-scientists, leveraging that in the appropriate manner, which is, again, kind of this conversation we've had both in the opportunities, but perhaps sticky challenges that we need to consider. So as we become better stewards of the open science community, we are not unintentionally making more barriers or more challenges or discrediting the fundamental science by relation. I wanted to ask a second question, and this is kind of building on the divides, right? So thinking about the global north, global south, but also thinking about other sectors. So as perhaps science information is more open, usable, can inform solutions, I wanted to kind of ask to the group what their thoughts are kind of for private sector application, private sector use of this open information. Does that increase maybe a likelihood or decrease the likelihood of maybe adding more barriers through kind of intellectual property conversations, and how we as a community can make sure that, yes, science is usable, but also its application and perhaps resources to inform solutions even within the private sector still follow or embody an open nature. So I wonder if anyone wanted to take a first stab at that. Stephen.
I'm happy to jump in on that. So again, I think as a principle, one of the things the exchange will ensure is that there is open access to the information and the knowledge that we're generating. I'm coming from an institution that is just a core policy. It is based on public money, and because of that, there is an obligation to be completely transparent in terms of the information that's made available. So data sets are made available freely around the world. It's all posted on the World Bank website, and people make active use of that information for a variety of purposes. One of the things that the bank has done that I think is actually a good way to ensure that some of that privately accessed information or compiled information gets into the public domain is through strategic partnerships, where actually some of the private entities who have some of this data, they want to partner with the World Bank or another major international organization because they see value from their private perspective, but they have, as part of the development of the relationship, they actually have to agree that anything that is done jointly with that institution now goes into the public domain. And so international institutions, government institutions are in a very strong position as they partner to insist that some of this data now enters into the public domain. So that's one strategy to do it. I think there will also be companies who will increasingly see that there may be tiers of information, some of which you keep for yourself and monetize for a very particular private purpose or effort in terms of future deals. But there is some that they can make freely available. So it doesn't all have to be hidden behind a paywall. Some of it can be shared publicly, and that is part of, ultimately, I think they're seeing a private interest out of growing knowledge, growing awareness of how access to data is actually good to grow a market, and they will benefit from that growth in the overall market size rather than keeping it all as proprietary information.
Great comments, both from the business proposition standpoint, but also public-private partnerships. I think you're exactly right. There are ways to open that dialogue. I wanted to see if any of the other panelists wanted to weigh in on that comment. Irena.
Thank you. Thank you for that wonderful first comment. I wanted to it made me think about the United States National Science Foundation and what they call the 10 big ideas. And one of those is something called convergence research, which is really designed for different sectors, including academic, government, industry, citizenry, coming together to solve some of the major societal challenges, such as climate change. And just as the previous speaker was saying, these strategic partnerships are essential. We need to work together. I believe that academic institutions are a place of ingenuity and innovation, largely because we have such incredible young talent. And I think that the resources come from industry and the enablers come from government. So we need to strategically work together. I think that all of these types of strategic partnerships are built on trust, but by working together and sharing that data, we can leapfrog forward in innovation that will benefit the business and industry in a good way. But at the basis of that is, in revolutionizing the way that we work together, there has to be safeguards for protecting IP, generated together through academic, government, and industry partnerships. So just wanted to add those thoughts on top of the previous presenter.
Thank you for that. I'm going to ask one more question before we go to the audience. So if you have questions, get them ready. I first was going to kind of ask a question what is one or two methods to embrace kind of this open science movement? But I wanted to add an additional layer to that is how might artificial intelligence and machine learning also aid in this process, or again, maybe introduce more risks? So that is up to any panelists who may want to go for it.
Yeah, I can start us off. So I think that a big problem with embracing open science is culture, because we are used to, this is my data, this is what I've done, and a lot of the times, not all the details are available, and this is just how we've been trained. Yeah. So as we're moving forward, I think the next generation of researchers have to be educated with open science being part of their research, not something they're going to add it as an automatic part of their research, and that would naturally just fix that problem. But then for researchers like me, that I've already gone through that education, so for me to transition more easily and embrace it, I really think that there needs to be standardization, because if I go to every platform and it's a different thing that I have to enter, it's going to become tiring. So for me to embrace it, if I know these are my guidelines, this is how it should be done, and it's going to be very similar, and I don't have to repeat myself over and over again. And so I think that would be really helpful. And there was a last part of your question that you added a layer, and I forgot, Mark.
AI/ML.
AI. So one thing I would add, if we could find a way that our data is ready for machine readable, because that's another thing. If I get my data ready for other humans to look at it, that's one thing. But if I now know what are these AI and machine learning codes looking for, so that I can have that data ready, that will eliminate a lot of problems. Even that cross-sectionality would be filled up with that AI system. Yeah.
Wonderful points. Irena?
Well, I couldn't agree more with the previous commenter panelist, because I publish a lot. I publish a lot of data. Having a standard operating protocol that transcends different journals on how those are formatted, and in particular making them machine readable, are all things that I think are excellent points. You asked about the role of artificial intelligence, and I think you were alluding to, is it a good thing or a bad thing? I think that there is incredible power in AI and deep learning of data. And again, I think that the easier we make those data and formats that we can apply some of those AI tools to, the better.
Great.
So there were some circumstances at the beginning of COVID when teams around the World Bank began, and there are many big data partnerships that the World Bank has, with telephony data, with satellite data. And there was an effort to begin to pull this information together as a way of anticipating where there might be COVID outbreaks in different cities around the world. And it was quite the journey for the teams to do that, but they began to find that they could anticipate with good certainty, based on machine learning by and large, where the next problem was going to be when you began to see an accumulation of telephony signals, and all of a sudden population movement towards a certain area on certain days, and you could track where the outbreaks were going to be just days later. So to me, that was really proof of concept that if you are thinking, very creatively about how you can use information that otherwise you would think, what the heck does that have to do with this issue that I'm thinking about? So I think I love what your point was about we need to help people begin to think about innovative uses and accessing this kind of information in ways that they never would have thought of otherwise. But it is predicated upon the public availability of some of these data sets, and that then creates the opportunity for all kinds of innovation.
Great points. And yeah, I think that AGU just this spring released a ethical framework on AI ML in partnership with NASA to better, within the context of geoscience, to start to address some of those ethical questions. And so I would encourage folks to take a look at that on our website. So I wanted to take the time, there's quite a few people here in the audience. Do we have any questions to the panelists?
I do. So one of the things that, again, day 6 in my new job, it has been some of the coolest 6 days I've had in a long time, because I'm coming to COP, and I've been to many of these, but this is one where I usually go for knowledge acquisition from panel discussions where I'm listening to great thinkers and world-class scientists and policymakers, what have you. Here I'm going with a more fundamental question, which is, as a startup think tank that has the opportunity to write its work plan for the next several years, what are some of the big ideas that we should be thinking about or possibly pursuing that would support transformation in really important ways? Not just in a city, a particular city, but we have the opportunity to think about bigger sets of issues. And so if you look at this particular issue, again, I've already been inspired from some conversations I've had in recent days about the role of community science and as a way to engage communities that feel ignored in the policy and finance process. So I've already taken away some ideas, but I would love to hear from others on the panel about, are there things that you think we could do as, and just by way of background, a consortium of research universities, a consortium that also involves private sector involving IBM, Moody's, and the Boston Consulting Group, and then 35 different community level organizations, including labor unions from around New York City, who are there to ensure that the big ideas we're talking about here are also grounded in the realities and challenges that communities are facing every day. So given that set of assets that I have access to, and given the opportunity that I have to do new, different, innovative, and I hope cool stuff, are there ideas that you can think of that we could fill a helpful niche for your kinds of research, or Irena, the work that you're doing in Toronto, or others are doing, where we could really help plug a hole or take some of what you've already done and help move it to scale more rapidly? I'm being very selfish with this question. I apologize.
So I have a very general response, and that goes back to a comment I had earlier, that look for solutions everywhere in the world. And sometimes we are just reinventing the wheels, and there might be solutions in part of the world that we just don't know, or because it's in the global south is not considered a legitimate solution. And I'll give you an example. And because we're in the Middle East, and I actually come from Iran on the other side of the Persian Gulf, so if you look around Dubai, you will see these structures. They're called wind catchers. I don't know if you've seen them. They're tall, kind of chimney-like structures extending above the roofs. And these are, they've been here for 2,000 years almost. And it's a natural ventilation system. The air just goes through from one side, and then the hot air, because of change of pressure, is pushed from the other side. Now, this is a sustainable solution that's existed, and I've seen it all my life. I never appreciated it because it's in the global south. And then a year ago, I was at a workshop, and someone a researcher from the Global North was explaining to me this innovative natural ventilation solution that he has. And as he was explaining, I kept remembering the wind catchers in Yazd, Iran, that I grew up with. And so when I point this out, it's not to say, oh, researchers in the Global North, you need to look at Global South. But even myself coming from that region, I did not appreciate that technology. So sometimes innovators can find those solutions exist already in other parts of the world. So my answer would be just look everywhere, look in communities like you mentioned, and appreciate that that solution can be everywhere and not reinvent the wheel. That would be my response.
Wonderful point, and that outreach and that and leveraging networks, leveraging other ways you can better learn is important. Great point and good question. Irena, did you have any thoughts?
I have so many, Stephen. I wish that you gave me forewarning of the question, because I would have come with a top 10 list. But because we want to hear from the audience as well, I hope, Stephen, that we can follow up afterwards. But one of the things I want to, maybe just because you asked, to consider what some of the big ideas that support transformation. Many times we come up with solutions that are a misfit for what society needs or what society is willing to take. And increasingly, we want to center community up front as we start the scientific process. And so I would, you may consider things, and the language that we're using is about centering justice and equity at the beginning of the innovations that we create, but also co-production and knowledge co-production. And this is a very, very different way of producing knowledge. I would consider it high risk, but high reward. But this is where you actually co-create the knowledge with the actors, and those are government, industry, citizenry throughout the whole process. There's a lot of overhead involved. It is very challenging work, but if you want to affect change and the transformation you're speaking of, we need to bring the communities into the conversations and into the knowledge generation processes up front and center.
Great point, and I think that really speaks to this message that you can have the best available, tailored product of information, but if you don't engage the community who's going to make the decisions or implement, it might not actually work the way you thought. So an incredibly important point. Any other questions from the audience? I see one, yes. Yes, thanks.
Thank you. So one of the ways that science is often shared fastest between scientists are conferences, such as the one we're attending now, and other conferences across the world. The upcoming AGU conference, for example. So what are ways that conferences are helping make science more open, that's communicated in person between scientists, and also ways that these conferences can improve moving forward?
Great question. Does anyone want to have some thoughts too? I'll just add it too. Yeah, go for it.
Thoughts on that. So I think that because of COVID, the fact that these conferences now have a virtual component to it has given so much access to countries that, for example, AGU, not everyone can get a visa to come to the US to attend it. And so that virtual component has become really important. I do also think having conferences in different parts of the world. For example, COP is here right now in UAE. If it was in certain other countries, again, access would be limited to some people. But beyond conferences, I do really want to go back to a point that Mark made. When it goes to access to literature, it's really expensive for certain parts of the world to access to that literature. When I moved to the US, the universities had access to everything I wanted. There were some articles I had to buy, but the price was acceptable. But when I was outside of the US, sometimes I had to reach out to other people going to the US universities to download those papers and send it to me, because my universities didn't have that access. And it was too expensive, and you don't need one paper to do research. You need a lot of papers. So going beyond the conference, knowing that there are people who can't be there, now how do you provide that accessibility to them?
Questions from the panel? Or sorry, responses or reactions from the panel? Irena?
I just wanted to say that I'm a very proud member of AGU. It was the very first conference I went to as a PhD student, and I've been going every year since. And I really believe that it is an organization that it leads the way in terms of transformative ways of engaging the participants. Some of the things that have come on relatively recently are a whole session that not only can you give your talk, but you can contribute to a policy forum. And I think that that is a way of making those bridges between science and policy and practice. But I think you want us to be a bit more provocative. And so maybe one way of being that is to really bring in practitioners into the AGU conference in a bigger way, whether they are in plenaries or every session, not every session, but relevant sessions, bring in those who are from government or industry or those who are from community and hear those voices in the scientific meetings as well. I'm not sure how that would play out in the early days. I think we'd have to work through that. But if we are serious, and my comment to Stephen in the last one was the importance of knowledge co-production, then maybe we need to create those spaces where those who are not typically going to AGU be welcomed, be invited, and to contribute starting at those conferences.
I think that's a great point. And just two things I'd like to pick up on. One, I completely agree, cost as a barrier to attend a COP, to attend an academic conference, massive. You are shutting out entire populations by having the high cost. Sometimes it's the visa, sometimes it's the airplane ticket, sometimes it's the hotel. I mean, goodness, the hotel costs in some comp venues, extraordinary. So that becomes a huge limiting factor. And that's why I think the shift to so many sessions being virtual is a huge advance and has really opened up access to this kind of information. One of the things, and to the Irena's point about trying to make sure that we are out engaging the community. So one of the really amazing things is that the city of New York has given us land on an island in the middle of New York Harbor to build our think tank. It's 5 minutes from the tip of Manhattan. It's looking straight at the Statue of Liberty. But you still have to get on a boat to get there. It's a 5-minute ferry ride. Not everybody's going to want to do that. And so one of the things that we're going to make sure that we're doing is that we are taking the New York Climate Exchange programming out into the community as well. So exactly to Irena's point, we're going to make sure that we're in all parts of the city, that we're talking to all parts of the community, that we, as I said, we have 35 different community organizations who we have partnered with. It's going to be part of their charter to make sure that they are helping us get access, that this information is flowing through them because they know this community. So we'll use them as the conduit to make sure that the scientists, the researchers, the policy practitioners, the industry experts can not just sit in fancy panels and fancy pavilions, but can get out into the rooms with the tables and uncomfortable chairs that are the daily reality of many of these organizations, but that's something that we're committing to do.
Wonderful. And I was just going to add, in addition to kind of scientific conferences, which were highlighted both the opportunities and limitations and ways to think new, I think having venues like COP or elsewhere where it's scientists talking to not just scientists in other parts of the world or in the global north or the global south, but having scientists engage with policymakers, practitioners, activists is very important to kind of innovate, right? You can think about new ways to do your work, inspire ways to inform your research or redirect your research, or develop projects to do community science in ways that you might not have done if you just stayed within kind of the scientific culture. So that was one point I kind of wanted to make. In addition, conferences are typically one point in time. There's a lot of time in a year. There's some time in the year. I wouldn't say there's a lot. It goes by faster and faster every year. It's December, right? But there's a lot of more days in the year. And so thinking more broadly, how do you take that experience at one point in time, build a network, build things more long-term to sustain that engagement, whether it's science to science, science to policy, community science, et cetera, to really inform your priorities in work. I think that's another great thing that, of course, the exciting in-person piece is one piece of that, but thinking how to sustain that engagement and those relationships is quite important too, from my perspective.
Can I just build on one of the points you just made? So, I mean, your idea of scientists engaging with the policy community is one of the very nice things that can happen at a place like this. Whether the words are being heard is a different matter, or whether the words are being communicated in a way, because sometimes there's a deliberate effort to ignore what the words are that are being shared. Sometimes it's because the words are not being communicated in a way that the policymaker will understand. And one of the things that, again, I think one of the great assets that I have access to through the exchange is because it's a network of research universities, I have access to different disciplines. I have multiple business schools. I have multiple engineering schools. I have multiple public health schools. I also have access to multiple schools of communication. And one of the things that we're going to be focusing on is helping scientists, researchers, do better at communication and figure out how is it that we can take the information that is extraordinarily compelling, make it accessible, make it influential by offering some training, but also offering some packaging in ways that makes it a bit easier to digest within a policy community like we have here.
Great. We have time for one more question. I see a hand. Christine. Christine, that's you.
So I want to build on this idea of specifically targeting training for scientists for communications. But instead of communications, how about training scientists to interact with policymakers? I mean, I think there's, those of us who are scientists who try to do this is something we do on our own time. We sort of volunteer, but you probably have a huge volume of scientists that would actually love to participate, but either they don't have time, their funding doesn't allow it, or a myriad of other reasons. So what strategies or what would you put in place to actually increase the capacity for scientists to actually engage?
I don't want to monopolize the conversation, but I do have ideas. So, before this session started, we had a conversation where before I started my new job, I was essentially the lead climate policy person for the World Bank, and I spent my days in places like this. And for the last 9 months before I left, I was the bank's lead negotiator in the loss and damage negotiations. And I had a completely different perspective on access to those conversations by negotiators than when you walk into the negotiations rooms here, and you stay for 15 minutes, 30 minutes, 1 hour, and you're scratching your head trying to understand what's going on. And I think you're absolutely right that the context, trying to help people understand there's a backstory here. There's a reason why you're hearing the conversation go in this direction or go backwards. And having people explain this process would be absolutely important and fundamental to helping you understand how you can influence this conversation in some meaningful way. So yeah, I think that's a great idea to demystify this process, to contextualize it in a way that's actually usable to you.
Mark, if I
Irena.
could just add on that, Christine, excellent point. And I'm somewhat horrified when people now introduce me as the person that bridges science to policy when it has been done by trial and error without any skills or training. You go in there because you're invited by a government to do work X and you hopefully will achieve Y. But as Stephen said, there are so many competencies that you need about conflict resolution, negotiation, understanding, and the role of policymakers and analysts versus the scientist. And bringing it back to the previous questioner from the audience, wouldn't it be great if the AGU could create a session where people could have those sessions, a primer on how to work better and build those bridges and understand and develop some of those competencies, whether it's the AGU or other kinds of organizations, that it should become part of what each one of us wants to engage in. And Stephen, if you have a retreat on your island in New York where you want to bring people together to talk about developing those competencies, I'm sure that you'll have a long waiting list for people who would want to participate in that.
I just had a quick comment that, and we were talking with Christine about this, that a part of it is also a change in the culture of science and engineering and acknowledging that these activities are also important, because right now they're only seen as engagement activities and not seen as part of your work. So putting it all on the scientist isn't fair, and making sure that it's going to be acknowledged as part of their work and it's going to be valued as much as the publication part, because otherwise that shift will not happen even if you have the training, when the incentives is publish paper and do the research.
Excellent reminder that the system in itself needs to work for the culture to shift and adopt. And I will add that AGU does have a program on engaging scientists in policy as well as working with policymakers called Voices for Science. It has been around for the last 6 or 7 years or so. We have a Voices for Science cohort each year that has recently expanded beyond just the US, but is through partnerships engaging in the UK and the EU as well, and hoping to help provide that support for other parts of the world as it continues to grow. With that, we are at time, unfortunately, but I wanted to wrap up by saying this has been such a great discussion that started at the highest level of what it means fundamentally by open science, what does that look like, to the challenges, the concerns, the things that we at the scientific field need to look out for and prepare for to help enable this transition and movement, but also what are the possibilities from engaging communities, not just with the results, but at the very beginning, from working with policymakers, from developing innovations between private sector and public sector entities, and of course, keeping to the mission of what it means and how we reward our different structures. So I hope everyone took a piece of this open science dialogue to heart and hopefully learned something new or something you can have a conversation over coffee later. But please join me in thanking the panelists for their time. Oh,
one thing I forgot to say, silly me.
new point.
One of the great things is that one of my partner organizations is AGU. So lucky me. Lucky us that we can work together.
Well, thank you. And we're happy to have this collaboration, and we look forward to the dialogue. So thank you again. And we'll see you later.